This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. On this episode, we're stepping into the vibrant, complex world of early 19th century Philadelphia through the eyes and brush of one of America's most important portrait painters, Thomas Sully. Joining me is Peter Conn, acclaimed scholar and author of Thomas Sully's Philadelphians, a new book painting the Athens of America. In this book, Conn reveals how Sully's portraits are more than just beautiful images. They're living documents that capture the people, institutions, and tensions that shaped antebellum Philadelphia. From abolition and education to commerce and culture, Sully's art offers a window into a city striving to define itself. Cosmopolitan, ambitious, and deeply divided. I'm happy to have Peter Conn join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
How did the idea for Thomas Sully's Philadelphians originate? Was it, Peter, the art or the city that called to you first?
That's a wonderful question. The answer, to jump to it, to jump to the reveal right away, is both. Since my wife and I moved here, as I said, as I may have said earlier, 50 years ago plus, I came to teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been interested in the history of this city. Although it was never my field of specialization, I became more and more intrigued by that period, particularly before the Civil War and long after the Revolution. If people outside Philadelphia, and even most people inside Philadelphia, think about the past of Philadelphia, their eyes immediately turn to Independence Hall, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, George Washington's presidency, and so on. And that's all perfectly appropriate. Those were gigantic events. But the period immediately thereafter, from about 1800, as you said, through the whole pre-Civil War period, was a time of extraordinary accomplishment. On the one hand, with a group of amazing individuals, many of whom are pictured in this book, and also, as you also said, a place of deep conflict, particularly over the issue of slavery. So the history has interested me for a long time. The paintings also engaged me. Philadelphia was Thomas Sully's home for about 60 of his 90 years. He lived, in other words, most of his adult life in Philadelphia. He painted, I'm not making this up, 2,000 portraits in the course of long life. We don't know where most of them are, but we know where a lot of them are. And many of them are in Philadelphia, since he lived here and was painting a lot of the folks in this city. Therefore, I had suddenly the idea, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, wouldn't it be interesting to begin to explore and perhaps provide brief historical accounts of what was going on and illustrate those sometimes with other images. For example, when we talk about theater, I have an image of an early 19th century theater in the book, but mostly through his extraordinary portraits of the people who were making the history that I was telling. And if you are a person, as I am, and as many people are, an admirer of Sully's work, because at his best, he's very, very good. There are more high-resolution color photographs of Sully's portraits in this book, that is 20, than in any other book ever published. And so it's a feast for the eyes. I can say that without taking any credit for that part, because that was Sully's work. And I hope it's also at least a small feast for the mind, because I bring together, as you suggested, chapters in which institutions such as the Library Company, the first free library in America, the American Philosophical Society, Pennsylvania Hospital, the University of Pennsylvania, where these institutions are discussed. Also, quite a few of the, what do I would call them, thematic issues that were going on. I mentioned theater. Philadelphia has a rich theatrical history and a somewhat complicated one. That's a chapter. I have a chapter on the Jews in Philadelphia. In this case, illustrated by the extraordinary woman, Rebecca Gratz. And then there is a chapter, probably the longest one in the book, on the fierce debate over slavery in Philadelphia during the years before the Civil War. That chapter is illustrated by, in particular, by a man named William Henry Furness, a Unitarian preacher who spent the 35 years before the Civil War preaching against slavery and for abolition. And the chapter also includes a lot of his opponents in that period. So, as I say, the short answer, Steve, is both interested me. I had been able over the years, because most of Sully's portraits are still in and around Philadelphia, I have been able to see them at the various museums, a couple of them in private homes where people were kind enough to let me come and take a look and get a high resolution photograph and so on. So I was able to see his portraits. I've lived downtown Philadelphia, which is the old part of Philadelphia on the Delaware River, for most of my adult life in Philadelphia. And that's where all this action was taking place. Independence Hall, for those who don't know, is 5 blocks from the Delaware River. It's on Fifth Street. And so on. And the American Philosophical Society is on Fifth Street. And so I live in the midst of that history and have done so for decades, and been looking at these pictures for decades. And the penny dropped at some point, and I said, I wonder if there's a way to put this material together. And that's what I tried to do.
You mentioned Fifth Street, and having lived in Philadelphia for a bit, when you walk that street, you really feel it. You feel the history as you're walking through Old City. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Peter, what makes Sully's portraits unique as visual documents for historians, and how should we read them beyond the aesthetics?
Okay, I think to begin with, we should probably pay attention to the aesthetics. This is not true of every one of his portraits, but then it's not true of any painter's portraits, no matter how gifted they are. They are alive, and they're alive in part because of his extraordinary technique. It's going to be hard for me to illustrate this convincingly without images in front of us. That's why I urge everybody to buy a copy of the book so they can actually see the images. But in any case, his technique is extraordinary. His ability to conjure up, for example, every surface in a full-length portrait, the fabric on the sitter's clothing, the bookshelves behind that person, the open window and the view outside, and the remarkable energy and lifelike vigor that these portraits show. They do not look like the wooden portraits of neoclassical architecture. Sully was a superlative romantic portraitist. He's in that period when vitality becomes a high criterion in trying to represent not simply the exterior of a person, but at least give a little hint into the interior of the person. In fact, I'll give you a very concrete example of that, if I can do it briefly. One of Sully's portraits, and it is in the book, is of the celebrated Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush, still actually somewhat known to, it was among other things, probably the most celebrated physician of the early 19th century when Philadelphia was the medical capital of the country. In any case, Sully's portrait of Rush presents him in a contemplative pose. He's seated at his writing desk. He's pausing. He's got his finger holding his place in the book he's reading. He isn't turned to look at us, but he's turned to think. It's Sully's attempt to present a man thinking. And behind that is an anecdote. A mutual friend of both Sully and Rush, everybody was mutual friends, it was a small city at that time. A mutual friend named Dr. David Hosack wrote to Rush and said, Rush, have Sully do your portrait. He will not only get your inside, he will get what you're thinking. Now, you can't literally do that, but that's exactly what Sully was trying to do. So it's dramatic in a very different way than simply a face-to-face encounter with an exciting individual.
You rarely hear that now. I remember David McCullough talking about John Adams when, Adams once was just sitting and thinking. You rarely hear people say that. So distracted now in this ADD world. I'm just sitting here thinking. You rarely hear that.
Yeah, yeah.
Carol Soltis praises Sully's luminous color and nuanced light. Could you speak to how those artistic choices contribute to the narrative or emotional force of these paintings?
I think it's, let me give again some concrete examples that I think may illustrate this. One of them is in that chapter on early 19th century Philadelphia theater. I begin that chapter by either reminding people or telling people, theater had a very controversial early life in Philadelphia. In the 18th century, the Quakers did everything they could to keep theater out of Philadelphia, just as the Puritans were doing in Boston. But when George Washington spent his 8 years of the presidency in Philadelphia, he was a theater goer. So suddenly everything changed and the theaters began to be lively and engaged and filled. I do include a portrait or a picture of one of the very early successful Philadelphia theaters, the Chestnut Street Theater. It seated over 2,000 and it was frequently full. And this was in a city that at that point probably had a population of 30,000. One historian says, remember, there was no television, there was no radio, there wasn't much except going to your Sunday sermon, and maybe if you're a guy, going to the pub to entertain you. So theater played an immensely larger cultural role than it can possibly do today, even in a town like Philadelphia or New York. Anyway, one of the actors whose portrait is included in this volume to illustrate this lively period, very successful period in America, Philadelphia theater history, is a man no longer very well known named George Frederick Cooke. He was a famous British actor who capitalized on his fame in London by becoming the first British star to travel across the Atlantic and perform in New York and Philadelphia. And that was at a time when New York and Philadelphia were considered to be kind of villages. They were not up to the British or even European standard. Sully's portrait of Cooke, full length, almost life size, portrays him in the role that made him famous, Richard III. And it portrays him in a glamorous costume with a wonderful smirk on his evil lips, obviously not wearing the artificial hump that many actors depended on to portray Shakespeare's character. He's enjoying his villainy, and that's emphasized by the fact that this portrait is set by Sully in a church. And the plume on Richard III's head arches back to point directly at the statue of a female saint. In other words, it's intended to underscore that Richard III loves being a bad guy. Mm. And so everything about the painting, again, it's virtuoso in its techniques, the plumes and the boots on Richard's feet and so on. Everything about the picture is exciting, but it's also capturing what many audiences may have felt at that time. This is a guy you can't take your eyes off, even though you wouldn't want to, as it were, well, you wouldn't want to have him behind you. So, and this is true of quite a few of the portraits. The one of, he did a portrait of Lafayette. And this is in Lafayette's old age. In 1824, Lafayette returned to the United States for a long, that is a year-long visit. And it was a triumphal visit because everybody was waiting for 1826, which was going to be a big centennial year. And everybody knew that Lafayette had been a young hero and had been actually almost Washington's adopted son. Everybody knew they were so close that Washington actually said, Washington was childless, as you probably know. Washington said, this is my son. And so 1824, the aged Lafayette comes back to the US and among other things, visits Washington's tomb down in Virginia. But he spends most of his time in Philadelphia. And the city fathers commissioned Sully, who by then was the principal portrait painter in America, happened to be in Philadelphia. They commissioned him to do Lafayette. And he did. And it's a full-length portrait again. It's here in Philadelphia in our National Portrait Gallery. He takes a few years off Lafayette. It's a little bit flattering. He gives him a little more hair than he had. He gives him a little thinner waistline than he had. But the look that Lafayette gives us conveys something of the charisma that people always felt when he was young or old about Lafayette. And he's in front of the State House, that is to say, in order to capture something of the drama of 1776, and one of Philadelphia's militias is marching behind him, carrying the American flag. So the whole thing is theatrical. It's as I say, charismatic. It isn't necessarily a reliable portrait of what Lafayette actually looked like in 1824, but it does the job that the city fathers wanted done, which was to commemorate and to flatter this heroic figure, and it does that.
Yeah.
So,
Was Sully ever directly engaged with the social and political debates of his time, or did his work subtly reflect them through his choice of subjects?
that's an exceptionally good question, and the answer is yes, at least in one topic. And it takes us back to the debate over slavery in antebellum Philadelphia. The principal portrait in that chapter is William Henry Furness, the abolition preacher. I think I mentioned him already. He was a Unitarian preacher, and Sully was a Unitarian, which was very much a minority denomination back in those days. A lot of other Protestants were suspicious of Unitarians because they denied the divinity of Christ. They got called deists and occasionally even atheists and so on. But Sully was a church-going, regular attendee at Furness's Unitarian Church. He was also an elder for a period of time, in other words, an officer. But as Furness began to concentrate more and more aggressively through the 20s, 30s, and 40s on abolition, Sully eventually became estranged. Sully believed he was anti-slavery, but he was anti-slavery in participating in a now fairly unknown movement called the African colonization movement. The idea that American Black people should voluntarily go back, as it were, to Africa. Back is ironic because they were all American-born Black people, but it was a very, very powerfully influential movement, which in a sense was competing with the abolition movement. It was saying to people, we have an alternative to the violence that will ensue, which it did, by the way. We don't have to talk about the Civil War, talk about how far this could go. So he said, this is a more peaceful way. It'll be good for the Black folks because they'll have a country of their own, because we had bought Liberia under very suspicious circumstances. But anyway, they'll have a country of their own. It has fertility. They can blah, blah, they can do all sorts of things. They can be their own president and so on. Sully affiliated himself with that fundamentally wrong-headed movement, a movement that had no legs. I said it was influential, but it didn't actually accomplish much of anything. It raised a lot of money. So anyway, to answer your question, on this key issue in early 19th century Philadelphia, Sully separated himself from the people who were joining his pastor, William Henry Furness, in more and more aggressively promoting abolition. A group, by the way, that included Fanny Kemble, the still famous British actress, who had also come to the US to perform with her father, and Sully and the Sully family and the Kemble family had become friends. And Fanny Kemble, although this is less well known about her, was herself a woman who was very eloquently opposed to slavery. And so there was a tangle of emotions and of partisan divides going on among these people who all wanted to believe they were doing the best, but were finding themselves more and more at odds with each other. The only other thing I know about his politics is that he voted for Henry Clay in 1840, who was a Whig. And so Sully was a Whig African colonizationist.
You drew on a wealth of archival materials for this book, some previously unpublished. Were there any discoveries that particularly surprised you or moved you?
Oh, my goodness.
Probably a lot.
I was going to say, Steve, that, well, for one thing, a letter, I just mentioned Fanny Kemble and her opposition to slavery. I found a letter of hers from the 1830s. So this is long before the Civil War is actually going to occur, obviously, in which she writes to a friend and says, I have written an article denouncing slavery. She's living in Philadelphia, by the way, at this point. I've written this article denouncing slavery, but I dare not publish it because in Philadelphia, if you are known to be an advocate for what she calls the poor black man, our Philadelphia citizens will burn your house down and you with it. So that was shocking to me. It's not that I found it inconceivable, nor do I know about how much violence was going on in this city in those years. But there she was. She eventually wrote a book on the horrors of slavery, which she wrote in the 1830s, but only published in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation. And she was so still influential or well-known in England that one historian has argued that Fanny Kemble's attack on slavery, published in 1863, was one of the factors that kept Britain out of the war on the Union side. Mm. So she's a heroic figure in this book, I have to say, as well as being a beautiful actress in a beautiful portrait by Sully. I mean, it's just a stunning portrait. And so there, that you do find wonderful things in archives. It's a little bit like archaeology. You know, it looks glamorous when they only put on television, here's the fossil, but 99% of your time is spent digging around in the dirt. Dusty archives are not always very exciting, but every once in a while, something comes up.
You find a gem. Yeah. Peter, and finally, what do you hope readers and viewers of this podcast carry with them after encountering Thomas Sully's Philadelphians?
Well, I would, to go back to something I said before, on the purely, as it were, aesthetic side, I would like to see Sully treated a little more spaciously and occasionally sometimes even more respectfully in art histories, that's at the specialist level, but also just be a little better known, both in Philadelphia and elsewhere. He is one of our major artists, and he's never had a book-length study before. There is no full-length biography of him. What I offer is a brief biography. It's accurate, and again, it's based a lot on archival things. I mean, discovering, by the way, that he would walk sometimes 15 or 20 miles a day, and at 50 years old, congratulated himself for reaching the top of a Catskill mountain ahead of all the young people. You said about surprises in the archives. But I'd like people to be introduced to, if they haven't been, the extraordinary work of this painter. And the second thing is, as I mentioned before, this period of Philadelphia's history is rich and interesting and fascinating, but it is after the period that most people have in mind. And by 1800, remember, politics has now moved away to Washington. Finance is about to move, is moving to New York. The shorthand for that is Chestnut Street was replaced by Wall Street.
Yes.
It is still the artistic, the cultural, the scientific, the medical, the theatrical, and the architectural capital. It's the most cosmopolitan city in America, as well as being torn by violence, the southernmost northern city. And that has something to do with this debate that was going on that sometime became quite physical.
Peter Conn discussing his remarkable new book, Thomas Sully's Philadelphians. Sully's portraits don't just reflect a moment in time. They invite us to reconsider how individuals and images shape the story of a city in the great city of Philadelphia. Peter, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to it, like it, share it, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And thank you for watching the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards.